They came from a direction that didn't exist. That was the first thing fleet analyst Dara Voss wrote in her incident log before the instruments on way station Kelta 7 went white with noise and stayed that way. Not north, not south, not any bearing her instruments recognized. They came from a vector that her navigation software simply refused to categorize, flagging it only as anomalous before crashing entirely. She had 3 seconds to look out the observation port and see them. A fleet the color of old bone, each vessel shaped like the thorax of some deep-water predator, arranged in a formation that her mind kept trying to parse as decorative rather than tactical. Then the EMP pulse hit, and Kelta 7 went dark, and Dara Voss floated in the silent black and understood that the war had already begun. The conclave didn't announce themselves. They didn't broadcast demands. That was the second thing analysts noted. Once there were analysts left to note things. The conclave's silence wasn't arrogance, wasn't an oversight. It was doctrine. Why communicate with something you've already factored in? Commander Sable Reyes learned this in the first 20 minutes of the Battle of Meridian Reach, when 3 of her ships answered the conclave's opening formation with a textbook flanking maneuver, one that had ended 6 human wars decisively. And the conclave fleet simply opened like a fist and swallowed them. Not destroyed, swallowed. The ships vanished into a geometry of overlapping energy fields, and then the fields collapsed and there was debris. The conclave had already modeled the flanking maneuver. They'd modeled the counter, and the counter to the counter, and 17 branches beyond that. What they hadn't modeled, what their entire civilization had never had occasion to model, was what a human commander does when she runs out of doctrine. Sable Reyes did what humans do. She improvised. All remaining ships, she said very quietly, match their formation, copy it exactly, move when they move. Her tactical officer stared at her. Commander, I know what it is. It was insane. It was mirroring a predator, pressing yourself against it so close the predator couldn't get leverage. It was something a person does in a knife fight when they've run out of room. The conclave fleet, which had every known human tactical response cataloged and pre-countered, did not have a response for humans who refused to engage tactically at all. There was a pause, and Sable would remember that pause for the rest of her life, would describe it in every debrief and memoir and quiet late-night conversation. That 3-second pause where an entire alien civilization encountered something it could not compute. And then the conclave fleet began to pull apart. Because you cannot fire on something you cannot distinguish from yourself. She lost her ship anyway. The conclave's secondary formation had been waiting for exactly this kind of desperation. They came in from the anomalous vector again, the direction that shouldn't exist, and the Meridian's hull opened like a wound. Reyes was in the forward observation bay when the breach happened. She remembered the sound. Not an explosion, but a kind of exhalation, as if the ship had been holding its breath and finally let go. She remembered the cold, space cold, the kind that doesn't just chill you, but informs you, tells you in every nerve that you are in the wrong place, a biological error in a vacuum designed for nothing living. She remembered falling. She did not remember landing. What she remembered next was the between space. She had no other name for it. It was not the observation bay, was not the debris field, was not anywhere she recognized. It was a place where the light came from no direction and the shadows pointed every way at once, and the paths beneath her feet made a sound like breathing, slow and deep and patient. She walked, because walking seemed correct. She didn't know how long. Time in the between space didn't behave the way she was accustomed to. Admiral Tomas Reyes was sitting on the edge of a walkway that ended in nothing, looking out at the luminous dark, and he had been dead for 6 years. Her father did not look at her immediately. He was doing what he'd always done in quiet moments, running calculations in his head, lips barely moving, fingers tracing invisible variables in the air. He'd commanded the first failed contact mission against the Conclave's outriders, back when humanity still thought the correct response was diplomacy. He'd been among the first to understand what they were actually dealing with. He'd been among the first to die for it. "Sit down," he said without turning. "I'm dead," Sable said. "Possibly. Probably not." He glanced at her then, and he looked the way she remembered him looking when she was 12 years old and had just failed her first navigation exam and thought her life was over, tired, fond, a little amused. The between space doesn't take passengers. If you're here, there's a reason you're here. The fleet is gone. Yes, he said it the way you say a fact, not the way you say a grief. He'd had more practice with that distinction than she had. The battle is over. The Conclave won it the way they win everything. They modeled it before it happened and they executed the model. The question isn't what happened at Meridian Reach. The question is what happens after Meridian Reach. Sapple beside him. The between space breathed. Some in the periphery of her vision. Shapes moved like memories. Other battles, other losses, other moments of decision hanging in the air like unanswered questions. You can't win against them with doctrine, she said. Not a question. No. You can't win with improvisation alone either. They'll model it eventually. Yes, she looked at her hands. Pilot's hands, combat scared, the knuckle of her right index finger still slightly crooked from a break that hadn't set properly during a medical shortage 2 years into the war. Every scar a lesson. Every lesson paid for. Then what do we do? Her father smiled. It was the smile he'd worn when she'd come back to him after failing that navigation exam and said, "Tell me what I got wrong. Tell me every part of it. I want to know." The smile of someone who has raised something that surprises them. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. "You're asking how humans beat the Conclave. The better question is, what are humans that the Conclave cannot be?" He stood. He began to walk. She followed him, through the between space that breathed and flickered, past the ghost shapes of decisions made and not made. "The Conclave models," he said. "Every civilization they've encountered, they've modeled. Species that fight by instinct. Species that fight by code. Species that fight by committee. Species that fight by spiritual conviction. They have a counter for all of it. What they don't have a counter for is a species that can do all of those things simultaneously and switch between them at will. A species that can hold two contradictory strategies at once and execute both, not because they've calculated it but because they feel their way into it." He stopped and faced her. "A species that will hum a tune while wiring a detonator, that will tell a joke before charging into fire, that will grieve their dead at the same moment they plan to avenge them. The Conclave finds this irrational," Sable said. "Incomputable," her father corrected. "Rationality they understand. Irrationality they understand. What they cannot model is the space between. The place where reason and feeling fold together into something that is neither and both. That place is where you live, Sable. That place is where humans live." He put his hand on her shoulder briefly. "A commander's grip. That's the only weapon they don't have a counter for." The between space shuddered. The light changed. "Time to go," he said. "Someone out there needs you alive." She opened her eyes to the sound of metal groan and the smell of recycled air and the face of Petsia Corvin Ash, who was 17 years old and bleeding from his ear, and who had apparently been keeping her breathing for the better part of 4 hours by a combination of jury-rigged life support and sheer stubbornness. "Commander," he said, "you're back." She looked around. She was in what had been the secondary cargo hold of the Meridian, now drifting free as a lifeboat, by virtue of having sealed off from the rest of the ship when the breach happened. 6 crew members, 1 operational emergency transponder, no drive, 11 hours of air if they were careful. "Status," she said, and her voice came out steady, and she was mildly surprised by that. Ash gave her the numbers. She listened without flinching. When he finished, she nodded once. "All right," she said. "Let me think," she thought. Here was what she knew. The Conclave fleet was still in system. She'd seen their search patterns before, methodical, thorough, modeled, to find every human survivor within a probability window of 97%. The remaining 3% was statistical noise. Humans called it luck. The Conclave called it irrelevant. Here was what she knew about the Conclave search pattern. It worked in arcs. Each arc covered a section of debris field, cleared it, moved on. Clean, efficient. Predictable if you understood their model. And she understood their model because she'd spent 3 years studying it. Because her father had left her 40 years of notes, and she'd read every page. Here was what she knew about the cargo hold. It was full of emergency survey drones, the kind used for geological mapping on unexplored planetoids. Small, minimal power signature, meant to scatter and ping back data from dozens of different locations. She looked at the drones. She looked at Ash. She looked at the 11 remaining hours of air. "How good are you with software?" she asked. Ash blinked. "Ma'am, survey drones. Can you repurpose the pingback protocol to broadcast a distress signal in a randomized scatter pattern?" He thought about it. She could see him thinking, 17 years old, and still running calculations like someone who hasn't learned yet which problems to give up on. "I could try," he said. I'd need someone to help me route around the navigation lock, and we'd need to pull power from." "Tell me what you need," she said. "Tell me every part of it." They worked for 6 of their 11 hours. The 3 other crew members who were conscious helped, and the ones who weren't conscious helped by being what they were. Reasons. The survey drones launched in a scatter pattern that mimicked debris tumbling on random vectors, and each one broadcast a distress ping at a frequency that the Conclave wouldn't recognize as organized, because it wasn't organized by any pattern they would recognize. It was organized by a frequency Sable's father had documented once in a personal journal entry, late in his life, trying to describe the rhythm of human thought: irregular, responsive, full of corrective loops and doubling backs, the kind of pattern that looked like noise if you were looking for signal. The Conclave's sweep passed over them, then passed over them again. The drones kept pinging, scattered like seeds in a storm. Rescue came 14 hours later, from the escort frigate Illyrian Crest, following a frequency that their AI systems kept flagging as corrupted data until their human signals officer looked at it and said, "Wait." Commander Reyes sat in the Crest's medical bay wrapped in a thermal blanket, drinking something hot that the galley called coffee, and that coffee had filed a complaint about, and she watched through the porthole as the Conclave fleet held its position at the edge of the system. Patient, inexorable, already, she knew, running new models. She thought about what her father had said in the between space, the place where reason and feeling fold together. The Conclave had every tactical playbook humanity had ever written. What they were still learning to account for was everything that happened between the lines of those playbooks. The hesitation before an order that turns into a different order. The ensign who ignores protocol because something feels wrong. The commander who, in the last moment before oblivion, chooses to hum a tune and wire a detonator. She finished the coffee. She picked up a pad and began to write. What she wrote was not a tactical report, not exactly. It was closer to a theory. It was something she'd been circling for 3 years. Something her father's notes had been circling for 40. Something that the Battle of Meridian Reach had finally brought into focus. The Conclave's disadvantage was not technological. It was philosophical. They had conquered every species they'd encountered because every species they'd encountered, when pressed to its limit, became more of what it was. More systematic, more chaotic, more devotional, more coldly rational. Under pressure, things simplify. They shed their contradictions and become pure. Humans, under pressure, got complicated. This, she wrote, is not a bug. This is the weapon. Word of Meridian Reach reached the scattered remains of the Fifth Fleet 6 weeks later, by which time the Conclave had pushed inward another 7 systems and Fleet Command was using words like containment and managed withdrawal that everyone understood meant something else. The briefing rooms smelled like old coffee and unwashed uniforms and the particular desperation of people who are running carefully modeled scenarios and finding that the models keep not surviving contact with the enemy. Into this walked Commander Sable Reyes, with a thermal burn across her left temple, and 11 surviving crew and a theory. They gave her a hearing because they didn't have much else to give. She stood at the front of a briefing room that held 42 senior officers, and 1 holographic projection of the current Conclave advance, and she said, "Everything we're doing is wrong. Not tactically, philosophically," she paused. "And I know how to be right." The silence that followed was of the particular quality that occurs when people who have been under enormous strain for a very long time encounter someone who is either a genius or has suffered brain damage and cannot yet determine which. She walked them through it. All of it, her father's research, the battle. The between space, she left that part out or told it sideways, saying only that in the aftermath of the Meridian's destruction, she'd had time to think and had reached certain conclusions. The survey drones. The frequency of human thought, the gap in the Conclave's modeling, not what humans do, but how humans feel while doing it, and how feeling and doing feed back into each other in real time in ways that no external observer can fully track. They model behavior, she said. They can't model consciousness. Not because they're not intelligent enough, because consciousness doesn't run on a fixed input-output loop. It runs on itself. The observer is part of the system being observed. Humans know this intuitively. We've been living inside our own contradictions since the first time someone simultaneously wanted to stay home and go to war, and chose both and managed to call it heroism. She looked around the room. The Conclave doesn't have contradictions. They've solved them out of themselves. It's their greatest strength and it's also, right now, their only vulnerability. Admiral Costanza, who commanded what remained of the Third Fleet, and who had survived 4 engagements by a combination of brilliance and what she privately called bloody-minded refusal to accept arithmetic, said, "Practically speaking, what does this give us?" "Practically speaking," Reyes said, "it gives us this." Every time we fight them in a way that can be fully modeled, doctrine, counter-doctrine, any logic tree with a root and branches, they beat us. Every time we introduce something that can't fully modeled, not randomness, not chaos, but genuine human contradiction, the kind that comes from being simultaneously afraid and brave, calculating and feeling, purposeful and improvising, we buy ourselves a window. The challenge is that the window is short. They learn. So we have to keep changing what we are. We have to keep being more human, not less. She let that land. Then she pulled up a sector map and pointed to a system called Vethera, which was currently behind conclave lines and which contained something important. The Vethara system had been a research outpost before the conclave advance, notable primarily for its population of stellacete, vast creatures that migrated through deep space on seasonal cycles, driven by magnetic gradients, navigating by biological mechanisms that human science still didn't fully understand. The conclave had noted them, cataloged them as non-sapient megafauna, and ignored them. This was, Reyes explained, a mistake. Stellacete navigated by gradient. Disrupt the gradient and they moved. They moved in herds. They moved through hyperspace transit corridors by instinct, folding space in ways that technically weren't supposed to be possible for organic matter, which was part of why human science still didn't fully understand it. A herd of stellacete moving through a conclave fleet corridor would not constitute an attack. It would constitute weather. It would constitute a biological event too chaotic to model in advance, occurring in a location the conclave had assessed as cleared and safe. It would constitute an opening. The admirals looked at the map. They looked at each other. Several of them were running the calculations and arriving at the same conclusion. This was insane. The plan relied on reactivating a disabled research outpost, re-establishing contact with the stellacete researchers, who might or might not still be alive on Vethara Station, using 3 years of behavioral biology data to trigger a migration event at a specific time and place, and coordinating a human assault through the chaos window, while the conclave fleet was occupied with something it literally couldn't compute. It was, as Admiral Costanza said, the stupidest military operation she had ever heard of. "I'll give you 3 frigates," she said, "and my best prayers." The insertion to Vethara took 9 days, running dark along the stellar edge, where the conclave sensor arrays had marginal coverage. Another thing Reyes had noted from her father's research: the conclave sensors were optimized for technological signatures and systematically undertasked on biological ones. They were in the dark because they were running like animals, not machines. The research station was still inhabited. Dr. Nevan Osei, xenobiologist, age 51, had spent 3 years alone on Vethera Station with his research data and his plant collection and a deeply philosophical approach to the possibility of death that he had arrived at by reading everything he could find about human history during the long silence after the comms went out. He was as Ash described him while watching him explain 3 years of stellacete behavioral data in 45 minutes at full sprint, very calm for someone whose situation was objectively catastrophic. "How do you do that?" Ash asked him during a break. O.C. looked at him. "Do what? Be that calm." O.C. considered this. "I decided early on that being afraid would take energy I needed for the work," he said. "So I chose not to be afraid. I've never quite managed it, of course. I'm afraid constantly. But I decided, and that decision lives in the part of me that's separate from the fear, and so both things happen at once." He paused. "Is that strange?" "No," Ash said. "That's basically what Commander Reyes says about humans." "What does she say?" "That we do 2 things at once when we shouldn't be able to. That the conclave can't model it." O.C. nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "I can see that, being afraid and deciding not to be, simultaneously, grieving and planning simultaneously. Mourning what we've lost and building what comes next, at the same time in the same hands." He looked at his hands. Researchers' hands, ink-stained, careful. "That's not irrationality. That's integration. We hold the whole thing at once. All of it. The contradiction is the point." They triggered the migration 5 days later. The stellacete moved like something dreamed rather than observed. Each creature the size of a frigate, their bodies trailing bioluminescent structures that human scientists had never fully catalogized, because every time you thought you'd understood the pattern, it changed. They moved through the transit corridor in a wave that the conclave fleet's instruments would have registered as. Reyes had estimated this carefully, a massive biological surge of unknown origin, yielding a sensor profile unlike any cataloged phenomenon. The conclave fleet paused. It was not long. Formitits 17 seconds. from the first Stellacid emergence to the first Conclave tactical response. But the Conclave's response was their standard protocol for unknown phenomena: halt, assess, model. And modeling requires data, and data requires time, and time was what Reyes had been buying since the moment she opened her eyes in the cargo hold with Ash's hands on her chest. The three frigates came through the transit corridor in the wake of the herd. What happened next was not clean. It was not heroic, not in the way stories later made it. It was loud and chaotic and terrifying and wrong in every way that a battle is wrong. People making decisions in partial information under fire. Systems failing at the worst moments. Ash at the navigation console, doing three things simultaneously, and being right about two of them, which was enough. The Conclave's second-line fleet responded faster than the model had predicted. The Conclave learned, always, and the window that should have been 6 minutes shrank to 3. 3 minutes to thread a frigate through a debris field, reach the Conclave communications node, and introduce a signal into their relay system. Not a weapon, not a virus. Something more specific, a recording. 43 minutes of recorded human activity from Vithura Station, compressed and formatted to mimic a data packet, containing among other things the sound of Osi talking to his plants, the noise of Ash running calculations out loud and arguing with himself, Reyes reciting the names of her crew during the long dark hours in the cargo hold, when she'd needed to do something with her hands, and her grief simultaneously, Osi's explanation of holding fear and decision at the same time, the particular frequency of human thought that was not noise and not signal, but something in between. The theory, her father's theory, finally finished, was that the Conclave couldn't ignore it. That encountering something unmodelable, they would have to spend resources modeling it. That every processor they dedicated to trying to understand what they were hearing was a processor not dedicated to the next tactical advance. It was not a victory. She never called it that. It was a delay. It was a bought hour. It was the first time in 2 years that the Conclave advance stopped, paused, stood at the edge of a system, and did not move forward. And Reyes sat in the aftermath with blood on her sleeve and a hole in her hull patched with emergency sealant and looked at the stillness and said, to no one in particular, "That's right. Think about it." The stillness lasted 11 days. 11 days in which the Fifth Fleet regrouped, in which the defensive line at Crescia held, in which 3 new ships came out of emergency commission yards, with crews that were too young but willing, in which 100 small decisions were made by 100 individuals who were simultaneously afraid and determined and tired and absolutely not going to stop. 11 days that were bought not by firepower or superior technology or divine intervention, but by the sound of a scientist talking to his plants and a commander saying the names of her dead. When the Conclave moved again, it was toward a different system. Lateral, not forward. Reyes looked at the telemetry. She looked at Costanza. Neither of them said anything for a moment. They're going around Crescia, Costanza said. Yes, they've modeled the delay tactic. Yes, they learned fast. Reyes was already looking at the next sector, where there were relay points and biological survey data, and 23 things the Conclave hadn't accounted for yet. Good thing we do too. Osi, who was now formally attached to the fleet as something the personnel records called a strategic consultant, and which everyone informally called the man who knows things, had gone back to talking to his plants. He did it in the briefing room now, on his off hours, when people were trying to sleep or eat or remember what those things felt like. There was something about it that the crew found. Not comforting exactly. Grounding. The plants didn't care about any of this. They grew because that's what they did. Osei talked to them because it reminded him, he said, that life continues in very small and stubborn ways regardless of everything else. Ash started bringing his coffee to sit near the plants. Then others started doing it. Then it became an unofficial gathering point, which became an unofficial ritual, which became something the crew called by various names, but which was essentially humans being complicated at each other in a small room full of greenery while the universe attempted to kill them. Reyes found it late one evening, at the end of a planning session that had run 7 hours. She stood in the doorway and looked at her people, tired, young, old, scared, stubborn, telling bad jokes, remembering something, planning something, holding 2 things at once, all of them, all at once. She thought about her father in the between space. She thought about what the between space had been. Not death, not life, but the place where the decision is made to return. The place where you choose to come back, not because it's logical, but because something in you insists. She thought about the Conclave, out there in the dark, running models. perfect, thorough, exhaustive models. Models of every human behavior they'd cataloged. Models that would never be quite complete. Because the thing they were modeling kept changing, kept folding new experience into itself, and emerging different, kept holding contradictions and refusing to resolve them. She didn't know if humanity was going to survive this war. She believed they could. That was different from knowing. It was a more human thing to do, to believe before the evidence was in, to act on the belief as if it were already true, and then do the work of making it true. She'd gotten that from her father's notes. She suspected she'd also gotten it from every human who'd ever stood at the edge of something impossible and said, "All right, let's see." She stepped into the room. Someone handed her coffee. It was terrible. She drank it anyway. "Here," Ash said, moving over to make room near the plants. She sat. Around her the conversation went on. About tactics, about home, about things that didn't matter, and things that mattered enormously. And things that were both, because humans don't file things into categories cleanly, never have, and the conclave's still, somewhere out there, trying to understand why. She picked up a pad. She wrote, Day 840, Fleet Holding, Advance, stalled at Crescia. New contact protocols drafted. OC reports the Stella Seat herd has been sighted at Renatha's system. Possible natural migration, or they're following us, he can't tell yet. Either way, he says it's worth watching. She paused. Added, we are still here. She put the pad down and looked at her people. Out in the dark, the conclave's models ran and never quite arrived. In the corridor outside, someone started humming. Something old, something with no tactical value whatsoever, something that was only music, which is to say, only the most human thing there is. Sound organized not to communicate information but to be felt, to insist on its own presence in the universe, to say, "Sigh, I am here and I feel this, and the universe has not convinced me yet to stop." The hum moved through the ship like a living thing. People picked it up and put it down, and changed the key, and forgot the words and hummed anyway. It passed through the walls of the briefing room, and into the space where OC's plants grew patient and green. Out in the dark, the models ran. In here, something else ran, stubborn, irrational, warm, and absolutely not done yet. Sable Reyes closed her eyes. Somewhere behind her eyelids, in a between space she didn't visit in waking hours, she thought she heard her father start to laugh. The war did not pause for grief. This was something Sable Reyes had known intellectually for years, and had learned bodily in the weeks after Meridian Reach. When the casualty notifications arrived at a rate that outpaced her ability to feel them individually, she read them, she logged them. She held each name in her head for a full breath, which was the most she could give anyone right then, and moved to the next. Later she knew there would be a time for grief to arrive all at once like a wall of water. That time was not now. What she had instead was the work. The work was extensive. The conclave's advance after their pause at Crescia had shifted character in a way that no one on the tactical staff agreed about. Costanza called it adaptation. Lieutenant Commander Priya Souls, who ran the xenobehavioral analysis team, and who had the specific exhausted energy of someone who'd been right about things too many times without being believed, called it something more concerning. Recalibration at the species level. They're not just updating their battle models, Souls said, in a briefing that had started at 0400 and showed no signs of having an end. They're updating their philosophy. The conclave has been a civilization of singular, unified doctrine for longer than we've had written language. The fact that we've introduced even one element they can't fully model has forced them to examine the doctrine itself. She paused. That's dangerous. A species that can revise its foundational assumptions is a much more adaptable adversary than one that can't. It's also a species that's having a crisis, Reyes said. Sauls looked at her. Revising foundational assumptions is uncomfortable, Reyes said. For a civilization that has operated on the same philosophical framework for their entire recorded history, being forced to ask, what if we're wrong, is not a small thing. It's the biggest thing that can happen to a culture. She looked at the sector map. We've done to them what they've been doing to every civilization they've encountered. We've introduced something they can't solve. And they'll solve it eventually, Saul said. Yes, but not before we've changed again. This was the doctrine, Reyes's doctrine, as it was becoming known in the corridors and briefing rooms, in the quiet way that informal names attach themselves to ideas of continuous transformation. The conclave modeled behavior. Humanity could not stop being modelable, but it could ensure that what was being modeled was already out of date. You had to be more current than the model. You had to be, in some fundamental sense, not yet finished. She had not arrived at this from theory alone. She'd arrived at it partly from Ose, who'd told her once, during a long transit between systems, that the most interesting thing about the Stellacete wasn't their hyperspace navigation ability, or their bioluminescent communication, or their apparent immunity to the kind of gravitational stress that would flatten a human body. The most interesting thing about the Stellacete, he said, was that they were never the same herd twice. Biologically, the individuals persist, he'd explained, surrounded by his plants, tracking the herd's movement on a monitor that he'd decorated with small drawings in the margins, plant sketches and mathematical notations, and what appeared to be a very small, very detailed drawing of a fish. But the herd's behavioral pattern shifts with every migration. They respond to what they've encountered. They carry their history in how they move, in how they respond. Every migration is the same animals with a different soul. He paused. I find that remarkable. You find everything remarkable, Ash had said. Yes, I decided to, very early on. It seemed like a more sustainable approach than the alternative. Reyes had thought about that a great deal in the weeks since. The decision to find things remarkable, the way a decision you make about how to meet the world becomes, over time, a fact about you. Changes not just how you behave but what you are, until the original decision is invisible inside the result. The Conclave, she thought, had made different decisions long ago, had decided to approach the universe as a problem to be solved, rather than a fact to be felt, had decided that variability was inefficiency, and that efficiency was survival. And they had been right for longer than humanity had been writing things down. They were wrong about humans. Not because humans were exceptional. Reyes held no particular belief in human exceptionalism, had read enough history to find that idea risible, but because humans were, by the accident of their evolution and their psychology, and the particular catastrophes that had shaped them, specifically the kind of thing that the Conclave's model of the universe didn't have a category for, not better, just orthogonal. Orthogonal, she thought, was enough. For now, orthogonal was enough. The second major engagement happened at the binary system of Tereth Vel, 43 days after Crescia. The Conclave sent a force Costanza estimated at 60% of their mobile fleet, which was a number that had no precedent in the engagement records, and which meant that the pause at Crescia had made them decide something. What they had decided, Reyes thought, watching the formation build on the tactical display, was that they were going to end this. One force, one engagement, overwhelming, decisive. The model that had been failing against humans at the margins would be made to work through sheer application of scale. She thought about Balin Skoll, not the real person, who existed only in the history records she'd been reading for research, but the character she'd built in her mind from the historical notes. The fallen general who believed that the old order had to be destroyed before something new could grow. There was a version of the Conclave's logic that was almost sympathetic, seen at sufficient distance. They had decided that the universe required order, that order required a singular solution, and that they were that solution. It was the same logic that had driven human civilizations to ruin 100 times over. The insistence that the map was the territory. She picked up her comms. All ships, she said. I want to tell you something before we begin. She had not planned this. It was not in the tactical briefing. Costanza was going to have opinions about it later. She said it anyway. We have spent 3 years studying how to fight an enemy that knows us better than we know ourselves. We have lost people we loved. We have won some small things and lost large ones. And we have arrived here at this system, at this moment, with less than we had before and more than we need. She paused. I don't know if we win today. I know we're not done. Those are different things, and I want you to hold both of them, because holding two things at once is what we do. That's not a weakness. That's the species. That's the weapon. She clicked off. Ash, at the navigation console, said nothing. He was running 3 calculations simultaneously, and had a small piece of tape wrapped around his left index finger, where he'd cut himself on a console panel 3 days ago, and hadn't had time to do more than tape it. He looked at the tape sometimes in the seconds between tasks, with an expression that was unreadable unless you knew him well enough to know that it meant, I am still here, this small and improbable fact. I am still here. The battle lasted 4 hours. It was not by any measure a decisive human victory. The Conclave's scale was real. Their adaptation was real. 3 of Reyes's ships were destroyed outright, and she would read those casualty lists later, would hold each name for a full breath and more, would carry them in how she moved. What happened at Tereth Vel was not a victory. It was a demonstration. Because the Conclave had modeled an engagement against the human fleet based on all recorded human tactical behavior, including Reyes's own innovations, including the Stellacete operation, including every improvised choice her crews had made at Crescia and before. They had built the most complete model of human behavior in combat that any external civilization had ever constructed. And then the humans had fought in a way the model couldn't fully predict. Not because they had invented new tactics, but because every individual crew member in that engagement was experiencing the battle differently, processing it through their own history and fear and stubbornness, making micro-decisions in the space between the orders. And those micro-decisions accumulated into an emergent pattern that was neither random nor designed, but something between. Something that the Conclave's engagement model, magnificent as it was, had been built to engage at the tactical level, and kept encountering at the level of 500 individual people, each being slightly, specifically, inimitably themselves. The Conclave advance did not stop at Terathvel, but it slowed, and in the intelligence data recovered afterward, in the signal intercepts that Saul's team spent 2 weeks parsing, there was a phrase that no Conclave communication had ever been recorded using before. Saul's flagged it at 0300, woke Reyes up to read it, and stood there in the doorway with the expression of someone who has found exactly the thing they'd feared finding, and is nonetheless grateful to know. The phrase translated imperfectly as, "The variants cannot be closed from outside." Reyes read it twice. "They're arguing," Saul said, "about whether to continue, about whether their approach can work. Yes, there's a faction, this is inference, the signals are unclear, a faction that believes the human problem isn't solvable with current methodology. And the other faction?" Saul's paused. "The other faction believes it is, that you just have to be thorough enough, that no variance is truly insoluble given sufficient model complexity." She looked at Reyes. "They're both right, in a sense. It's not a question of intelligence. It's a philosophical difference inside the Conclave about the nature of the universe." Reyes thought about that for a long time. She thought about Osi's plants growing stubbornly in their cracked jars. She thought about the Stellacete herd moving through hyperspace with their accumulated behavioral history changing with every migration. She thought about Ash's crooked finger on a navigation console, his face in the space between calculations. She thought about her father in the between space, running numbers in the dark, saying, "The better question is what are humans, that the Conclave cannot be." She thought, "They're having the conversation. They're asking themselves if their model of the universe is complete. They are, for the first time in their history, uncertain. That uncertainty was not victory. She would not mistake it for victory. But it was the thing that made victory possible. Not tomorrow, not easily, not without more losses that she would carry in how she moved. But possible, the way things are possible when two parties meet at the edge of what they each know, and discover that the territory is larger than either map. She went back to sleep. She slept 4 hours, which was more than she'd managed in 2 weeks, and in the morning she drank terrible coffee and sat near Osi's plants, and wrote out the next phase of the doctrine. And it was not the same doctrine it had been at the beginning, because she was not the same commander who had begun it. And that was right, that was correct, that was the whole point. Somewhere in the dark, the Conclave ran its models. They ran beautifully, completely, with the full terrible efficiency of a civilization that had answered every question it had ever asked itself. They ran, and at the edges, at the margins, in the variants that could not be closed from outside, something kept not fitting, something kept humming,